Hey teachers, Haley with Teacher's Pet, back for episode 3 in my show and tell, breaking down my class and ungraded course tour series for the summer. And so in this video series, we have been looking at the class I taught in the spring. It was a 2000 level, very project-based, intro to technical writing course that I did use very, non-traditional kind of alternative ungrading and universal design principles to complete. And so I'm just showing you what worked, what I would change, and a glimpse into my student feedback about those, just to help you, make maybe some decisions of what you want to do next semester as you might be switching up and redesigning and building some classes for yourself. Now in episode 1, we just did overview, context of what the course is, and you can grab that link there. Last week, so in episode 2, we went over my course shell kind of structure, what the homepage looked like, what my modules were set up like, and what my syllabus looked like. So if you missed that video, definitely recommend just checking that out, so that way you know the overall structure of the class, and you can also just see kind of what the learning outcomes, what the goals, all of that was all about. Now in today's video, we are focused on my participation points. And so for me, that is, what my reading kind of homework pages look like, how I set up my quizzes with a few little tips that I did a little bit differently that worked pretty well for me. And then what other just kind of like small weekly activities and some tools that I used there. You can also grab all of the tools, including pages, HTML little template pages for the stuff that I'm showing you over at teacherspet.tech in our freebie shop. So if you like the look or the idea of some of this, you can definitely speed up your course prep, download the template, and then of course use what is helpful, edit what you need, and save you hopefully a little bit of time. All right, I'm pretty excited. This is definitely the thing that worked the best out of my class, that I really, really love. So let's flip the camera and I will show you my Canvas shell and talk participation points. All right, so I'm back in my Canvas student views just so we can walk through it together. And so this video I am focusing on participation, which for me is really the, kind of small activities, regular homework. So I kind of group all of that together into things like the course materials, so the reading, lecture kind of content, and there's a quiz that they do to hold them more accountable to keeping up with the readings. Our writing labs, so this class is hybrid, meaning that we meet once a week for 75 minutes. So most of the class actually is an online class, and I really tried to set up this participation and in the course to create a good online learning experience. And then there's the added benefit, I guess, of meeting once a week. And that is way, above me and my pay grade. That's just how this class is offered and assigned. And then I also have an actual participation group of points, which is a document analysis that we'll look at, and then how I set up my reading quizzes, and I'll just show you the back end for how I set that up, because students were able to take it as many times as they wanted, and using their points. And I did some kind of a little bit different things just in Canvas that I really like. So these kind of participation point elements were definitely some of the highlights that I'm really proud of, because in my course evaluations, this is really where students talked the most about. And since this was essentially an online class, I really tried to spend a lot of time figuring out how to make the materials and all the online kind of homework content good and get them to participate and feel engaged, since we weren't meeting, 2-3 4 times a week. So in terms of the things that contributed to the learning, this is just where a lot of people talk the most about it. So it's things like, every weekly reflection had a question, asking them to come up with examples. So I'll just show you what my reflections look like. Nothing that novel, but I just find having just inspiration of how all sorts of people do it can be helpful. So I'll just show you my version that they talked about. And then they also, right, having 3 things to do each week, get me engaged. That's where I did spread out my participation points throughout the whole week. And that was definitely an intentional thing instead of having them all due at the end of the week or something. So I would do that again. Audiobooks. I was writing a custom OER textbook course pack, and that included a podcast version. And so a lot of people talked about the podcast, or essentially audiobook version of it. We had explanation of the concepts, the podcast, interactive labs, multiple options for the learning materials. I'll show you and just talk you through my workflow of how I was able to produce this amount of content, because they also liked, right, my notes, and again, that kind of podcast video lectures, real life examples, all things that they really, really liked. And why I chose to do this OER book, why I liked it so much, was that, they said, okay, the readings directly related to the assignments and my activities related to the assignments, and all of that was accomplished with what I talked about in episode 2 of this series last week, with making sure to track my learning outcomes and projects and materials in my course building spreadsheet, so that way I was always visually keeping tabs literally on how things were related to each other. Now, when it came to the things that could be improved, most of this box we'll talk about next week when we get into the projects themselves, because that's where most of the suggestions come from. But when it relates to this week, it really is finish my book, finish my podcast and my notes, because we'll see, and I'll show you, I just didn't have time to get it all done. I've been working on it over a few semesters, and so the very kind of end of the semester, I just ran out of chapters, and I just pulled more traditional types of sources for them. So yeah, I'm really excited about that and really proud of kind of this section. So I don't think I'll see too much that I necessarily want to change, because I think it worked the best. It was the best part of the class. But of course, good things can always be improved, just like things that aren't working have some element that we want to, hold on to. So we'll find what could be improved, even though it worked overall pretty well. So we'll look at the lecture and reading pages, my writing labs, my other stuff. But first, I just want to show you the overall, how I set up participation points in this class. In my overview, right, is where I kind of track the assignments. And so participation was everything in these blue boxes, essentially. And with my participation, there were 12 points worth of lecture, notes, quiz. So essentially every single week, well, not every week, but I'll go up here and see all of the main weeks with content. I worked it out, so I had exactly 12 units of content, and each one was worth half a point, so that way, I got just to a nice even sort of 6 and 6 for 12. And then there were 3 points for doing these lab reflections. So in total for the participation group, they were earning, or kind of had the cap of 15 points. And with my class, getting an A required basically 40 points, and every 10 points leveled them up to the next letter grade. So they basically started at 0 with an F, D was 10, C was 20, B was 30, A was 40. And so, 15 points of participation allows them to pass the class with a D if they didn't do anything else, at least keep up with all the weekly materials and engaged learning that way. But it definitely was, a pretty big chunk, actually, that they could do in a kind of an easy way to get a lot of points. And I did set it up that way because since it is a project-based class and a very kind of applied professional type of class, I did want to really incentivize them to do these kind of weekly learning kind of content and not just try to get the big projects done. So that's how we kind of set it up. Now with the lab reflections, they needed to do 10 out of the, kind of 16, 15 potential options for the semester. So they did, they were able to basically drop 5 weeks worth and still get their credit, which was also good because I am in Colorado, and during the spring semester we have most of our winter weather happens in the spring, and I did have quite a few classes that had to be canceled for weather, and so having that pretty big amount of 5 dropped weekly participation points allowed me to not stress when class was canceled or campus was closed for the weather. So that's how I set it up in the gradebook that way. Okay, so hopping first into the reading kind of area, which was always sort of first in their weekly checklist. Or since it ended with finals week, we don't get that, but I would basically be like, here's your reading topic for the week. And then it would go down into their quiz, document analysis, and so on. So on the reading pages and what I essentially set it up to look like, and this is, kind of the intro. We'll look through a few pages because they all did the same. But I basically had my required material box, and this is what I expected them to do every single week because that is what their quizzes were going to be based off of. So this was the box of this is your homework, you need to do it. So within that, I did create a little Quizlet class, so that way they had these different kind of flashcard options, and though I didn't see a lot of people necessarily using it for me, so you have 9 sets out of the 12 total, so that's definitely something I should continue building on, even though it didn't get a lot of use value necessarily. So I offered that, and then I also every week, and this I did do every single week, have this note-taking guide for them. So I just use Google Slides, and I definitely want to explore different, more interactive tools. But for now, I just use a little Google Slide, so that way they could, copy and create their own if they wanted to. That basically just gave them little prompts for the videos. And with this, I consider it a note-taking guide because it's, hey, here's what you should pay attention to, not a summary of all the key points or anything. So it is still you need to do the reading yourself, but make sure you could answer these questions at the end. So let me kind of show you what that actually looked like in practice. So they had a mini lecture video. It's just a video. I tried to keep it 20 minutes long. And it's just me talking about different, concepts, topics, the deal. And then I had the reading chapter, which also had a podcast to go with it for the ones that I was able to finish. And so with my reading chapters and how I accomplish this, and what I would definitely just stop and recommend, so that way you can produce that much more content, I started with the podcast. So I started with a script, so that way, I could really quickly record it. And I actually did record it into camera. I just haven't cut any video versions yet, but that is something that I would like to do. I have the footage available. So I've recorded it to my camera based on a script. I do have a small teleprompter, but if you don't have that, what you totally could do is just give your lecture just like you're used to doing, just record your regular lecture, and then, edit it, cut it. And from there, I was able to export the audio to create a podcast, and I just use the Spotify for creators just to make it easy, but there's a ton of tools you could use there. And then I took that transcript, my cut, edited, final version of the lecture, pulled the transcript from that, and then formatted the transcript into my textbook. So it actually, was a very smooth, efficient production cycle. So you could record your lecture, and then you'd have a video and an audio version, edit it, and basically all the major editing programs. I happen to use DaVinci Resolve, but you could use, Premiere also has this, and I've edited it in that as well. Get the transcript and then format the transcript. So with that, I basically, as they read, they can literally listen or read along, and I had many students say that they did that, and it kind of feels like an audiobook in that way, because this is literally exactly the transcript of what I'm saying just formatted to be a nice reading experience and not what transcripts usually look like to read. And I do go through and add, little GIFs, and that's just part of my like teaching persona. And again, students have commented to my face, that they like it, and it does make it lighter and a little bit nicer to read. Now, within the note-taking guide, one thing that they were kind of commenting on and alluding to was that with my notes, I would offer them kind of some audio cues just to try and help them, stay focused and know what I was talking about. So, for example, right at the beginning in their note-taking guide, they should be able to explain the difference between essay writing and technical writing, which is, just in a very specific kind of field. But other times would be like, hey, what are the 3 characteristics of effective writing? You would just, put your main topics. But I would put an audio cue in the podcast, a little ding to indicate, hey, there's something you should take notes on. Check your note-taking guide. Or this little star symbol, which now I know everyone's like, oh, that's like a sign of AI. Listen, I am a cuspy millennial. This is my favorite emoji. That's just what I used. And so in this case, they're like, okay, what are the 3 characteristics of effective technical writing? We go back into my book. We can, and they start scrolling through. They're like, okay, the qualities. Oh, here's that star symbol. And same when they were listening to the podcast, they would hear a ding is a key point you should write down and be able to, write down kind of what that was. And so having those really guided notes is something that they really enjoyed. And when we had to go back into just like traditional regular textbooks, it was the end of the semester. So I'd hope that they, had learned enough to do it on their own. But I definitely had some students be like, I really miss that you did that. I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm working on it. So that was kind of that. The other thing that I really liked with the podcast lectures is that I had a few other audio cues. And so I'll just go ahead and play those here. So that way, again, students could really focus in on like what it was that they were listening to. This sound means a segment or major topic. Think a heading. After each section, you will hear this sound, which means stop and check your notes because it's a recap. All right, and I think I'll make future videos getting more detailed into exactly how and what I did to set up all of this kind of stuff. But for now, let's just keep moving through what students actually experienced. So after their required materials, then I always gave them just like bonus materials, and I always gave them 1 video, 1 research article for that more scholarly level. This was an intro level class, right? And I'm working with first and second year students. And so, the intention here wasn't to have them read a bunch of extremely technical high-level documents. It's intro. So I did want to give them the chance, though, to start, tackling 1, peer-reviewed research scholarly article on the related topics, and then they would do their document analysis. Now, this is a place that I actually will change the course design to pull up the document analysis into, I think, maybe an opening like, here are your homework checklist type of stuff. So like, here's the lab, that's related to it. Here's your doc analysis that's related to it. And here's your quiz, and put it at the top of the page instead of kind of having it in these optional bonus materials. I had initially done it because it is technically optional, as are all of the project choices they can make, but I can understand like why that's a little bit confusing. And some students were like, do I have to do this? And it's like, I mean, it's worth points, but you don't have to do anything, right? So I would definitely change that. And then last, I always gave them this little other perspectives box where I just linked, 2 other OER textbooks. So that way, again, it's like, hey, maybe the way I described it or the examples I used didn't make sense to you. These other authors are talking about the same topic. Maybe the way they explain it would work better. So I always gave them that option as well. And so if you would like, I actually have this page is available in the Teacher's Pet shop if you would like to grab that. And so if you just head over to the website in our planner shop, under the freebie section, I do have this class materials layout that you can just copy and paste right away. And so what you're going to do there, if you grab it, you'll get this text file, and you'll be able to just copy everything from that plain text file, paste it right into your Canvas or LMS if it supports HTML, and then you get the layout. And this is going to be my new layout as well. And so here I'm putting that homework checklist to make those buttons a lot easier for them to see. And you can just, of course, then edit and replace the titles with anything that you need, delete what you want. Then I'll have my assigned materials section. And I probably will also link my office hour button so that way they can follow up on questions more quickly and easily, and then link their study guide. And then I have my bright spaces for my video, audio, reading, but you can just delete what you need. So again, really encourage you to try out that workflow so that way you can just maximize the mediums of your materials in kind of one go. And then the optional materials section and my other textbooks. And if you don't like the color scheme, because it is Teacher's Pet colors, of course, then you can always just grab our editor, where you can hop in here and really quickly and easily change the colors of anything. You will need a little bit of HTML knowledge, but basically you'll just look for anything with this hashtag is a color code, and I do have a color code glossary for just some really common colors, so that way you can grab some of these new colors that might align with your university and upload it, and you can see how it just changes the colors there on that page, and then you would copy it into Canvas. All right, so that is my kind of reading, what they would do each week, and that's again where everybody I think was the most interested and excited about it. So now let's quickly just breeze through the rest of the participation that they were expected to do. So, which was also like less work for me, but basically they then we would have our lab. And so with this, I did a lab reflection that was worth like essentially half a point each, but that is substantial by the end of the semester. And with the lab reflection, what I basically did was, hey, you attended lab, so summarize what the activity that we did in lab was practicing, brainstorm how you're going to use those skills, and that was something that they really liked, and a lot of students then would comment things about it that I could directly respond to, and then prompted them to ask any questions and clarifications. As sometimes students just don't want to speak up in class necessarily. So this was just an easy avenue for them to ask questions. And then I would just put, my timing. Here's loosely the game plan, what we were going to do, with a link to my slides. Again, I was just using Google Slides because they're so easy to share here so they could follow along. I use a tool called Slido for my labs, which were then these interactive kind of things. And so that way it's just a polling software, but I have had students, kind of talk about how Slido feels like a grown-up version of like Kahoot and those gamified, and Slido is made for like corporate meeting engagement. And then I stream record all of my classes. So I would give them that link as well so they could go back and re-watch it. And now with this, I did also give them the option to write it out, which most people did, post a video, which I had consistently. A few people always do the video option, and that was really nice. Like, watch and hear them, or audio, and I had one student who consistently recorded just audio. So that's another great place where you can add more universal design practices. That also goes kind of to ungrading because it was one, just complete incomplete, and as did you summarize accurately? Sometimes I had to give an incomplete because I'm like, that's not what we did at all. Like, I don't believe that you showed up and paid attention, but it's completely incomplete, so fast for me to grade, but a good quick check-in where I could just focus on responding to what they were saying. And the outcome was, hey, can you use metacognition? Can you think about what you were thinking about while we were in class and apply it to other areas? That's what I needed to assess. I didn't actually care if it was written, video, or audio, as long as they were doing those things. And so if you give them the options, then everybody can explain kind of to you the way that suits them. So that was like the next part. The other things, they did 2 more things every single week in participation. So the next thing after the lab was, and in this participation group, which as I talked about last week, I am going to move these assignments up into this area again, just to make it easier for them, though it was always linked in their checklist. But the next thing was something called a document analysis. And so every single week I would do, just pull a like real world professionalized example of whatever we were talking about. That works well for this class since it is a technical writing class, so I have lots of examples. But if you are doing a little bit more maybe a conceptual type of class, I'm sure you could find like a pop culture example to give them, or maybe like an example of the projects that they're working on. Or you could maybe, instead of doing an analysis, ask them to go find an example, discover a little case study of whatever you were talking about. But for this class, I was able to just pull examples every week. So the very first one was the syllabus that I had to go through, and I used this tool called Hypothesis that my university was kind of piloting and has paid for licenses on. I do really, really like it though. And so I'm actually going to leave student view just so you can see what Hypothesis looks like. Because I really liked it. And basically it's just an annotation tool. Like there's lots out there that I'm sure you can find. And so I gave them prompts each week that again related back to what they were reading and we were talking about in labs. And then they were able to leave comments. They had to leave at least 3 comments on there. And then I also found though that when I closed the assignment, they would lose access to that project or to that file. So I also gave them this like access to the document plane so that way they could go reference it if they wanted. I don't think anyone ever did, but that was important to me. So then when they loaded up Hypothesis, it just kind of loaded up their elements over here. You can see I had 53 annotations in this one section. It does break it into the various sections of my class, and then as you scroll through it shows what students are highlighting, and then I can just go read those comments. Now with this I did autograde this, and so within Hypothesis I was able to essentially go into just their auto grading feature and just had it set up so that way, hey, if they have 3 annotations, give them credit for it. And then I would just sort of kind of spot go in and just respond to some comments. But to be honest, like this assignment, I basically just kind of let them explore on their own. Of course, the first few weeks I did comment really heavily on every single person's every annotation just to encourage them, make sure they were on the right track. But after that, most of the semester, it was just auto-graded, complete, incomplete. You should get what you want out of it. And then the very last thing that they did was this quiz. And so with the learning check quizzes, they could complete it as many times as they wanted or needed to get the score that they were after, but I was actually pulling from a bank. So these are worth 5.5, half a point. So I had 4 questions that were, just pulling randomly from my larger bank of questions. So that way they were getting kind of different stuff every time. And then the last question was always an open-ended, so I could really tailor down and again respond to what they were saying directly. And so as they were like going through the questions though, it was switching it up just so they could. I had multiple questions about similar, obviously, concepts and topics from my readings in the lecture. And within the questions, it actually, let me go into one of the banks. Instead of giving them the answer, right, if they got it wrong, instead I would tell them where they could go back and find kind of that answer. So for example, one of the questions in that first week would be like a scenario. Hey, you're preparing a report on the effectiveness, there's lots of studies, blah, blah, blah. Was the writer's decision, ethically sound? And then, because they read about ethics in that chapter, they, could make that decision. And then in terms of what they were shown, for the feedback. So if they got it right, I'd say, good, you recognize there's a lot of positive evidence, blah, 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 just reinforcing what they had learned. And if they got it wrong, I would say, hey, revisit your notes from slide 23 through 25 of the note-taking guide, because that's where I know they had questions and prompts that would have helped them answer this question correctly. The answer is in section 3 of the lecture, or the chapter. And again, if they're listening to the podcast, I had the kind of chapters marked with some sound cues, or obviously the textbook version, they could just scroll to section 3. So that's how I set up every single question on the back end. So that way, if they were retaking the quiz, it wasn't just memorize the answer, but here's how you should go review and find the answer. In other words, that question was true or false. That one's, kind of easy. But I had, loads of others that were not true or false. I had a lot of different types of questions. And then in terms of the actual settings, shuffling the answers, that's fine. And then multiple attempts, keep their highest. And I didn't make them do any waiting periods. I tried that one semester, but I just found it's because I had so many options within the quiz bank, I just found I didn't need to make them wait if they wanted to retake it right away. I was fine with that. And then in terms of how to make sure they could see kind of the element, they'd hide. So check that, show questions, show student responses, indicate it as correct or incorrect so they know which ones they got wrong, but not show them the correct answer. So if it did kick that same question back to them, they wouldn't immediately just know and be able to memorize and look back at what the correct answer was. But I would make sure to show feedback so that way they could again see where in their note-taking guide they should have had the answer to that quiz. And that rounds out what I did for participation. Now, the grading was a little bit weird because in their grade books, I had to do a couple little things. So since they only needed to do 10 total lab reflections, I did have to move that into its own assignment group so I could use the drop score function. So in the assignment group area, there's the overall participation, which is just the document analysis and the reading quizzes. This first was just a practice lab reflection, so it didn't count for anything. And then lab reflection points. So there was 2 points that, again, they got all 2 if they completed 10 lab reflections. But then I had this separate lab reflection assignment just so in Canvas I could enforce the rule about dropping the lowest 5 scores. And then when I was looking at the grade book, I made each one worth 0.1 point. So that way when they got to 10 with the drop function as well, they would have earned a point. So that's how they got their 3 total points that make up the end of the participation area. So that part was weird. They didn't necessarily see that as much in their grade books. That was more of how I had to set it up to get it to work and run right. But I did have to just pull it into its own little group and set it so that way when I was looking at the grade book, if they got 1 point, then I knew that they did all 10. I didn't have to count them out or anything. So that also made it really easy for me. Now what it did look like on their side for their grade book, getting a teensy bit messy. My test student, when I scroll all the way down to the bottom, so there's out of the 14 for the participation, and then this one, because my test student account, I actually only did 8 out of the required 10, right? It's showing as 0.8. And so that's what I was testing, just to make sure that how it would look. And so any students that had 1 out of 1, I knew that they did all their lab reflections and then could add that into their overall participation score, as it would kind of go in there. Woof, all right. And yeah, I think that's pretty much what I did for that resource in participation scores in my Canvas shell for this class. All right. Thanks, teachers, for following along. definitely leave a, comment or share this video with other teachers that are working on prepping their classes, especially some that are interested in trying to do more universal design practices or ungrading. I would love to hear about your course designs, what you are proud of, especially with how you set up participation points or what you do to keep students engaged week by week when they don't necessarily have an exam or a project or some big end of unit thing going on. So let me know. So curious to hear. And until then, I hope that you have a great class, or at least a good time prepping your class. Join me next week for episode 4, where we are going to talk about some of the specific projects and how I set up all of my project sheets, which is really where this ungrading kind of principle comes into play. All right. See you then.